It all started on a typical Saturday night, one of those family dinners that seemed harmless at first. My mom had spent all afternoon preparing a huge meal. The house smelled like roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and garlic bread. My siblings were chatting, catching up on the latest gossip from work and school, while my dad sat at the head of the table, silently observing. The evening had all the usual elements: laughter, teasing, the clinking of silverware, and a sense of togetherness that I'd come to rely on. But there was always something different about our family dinners, something beneath the surface that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was the underlying tension between Daniel and me, a tension we tried to mask with forced smiles and polite conversation. It had been building for months now, ever since that one incident when Daniel had been distant, almost disconnected. I could tell something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. His usual calm and patient demeanor had begun to wear thin, and the cracks in our relationship had become more apparent with each passing day. But tonight, I told myself, everything would be fine. It was just a dinner after all. We gathered around the table, everyone seated and ready to dive into the meal. My mom made a toast, raising her glass to family and health, and we all clinked our glasses together, exchanging pleasantries. The conversation soon turned to something lighter: an event in the neighborhood where a man had been attacked outside his house late at night. My brother Luke made a joke about how dangerous things were getting, and how people needed to start protecting themselves better. That's when Daniel, who had been unusually quiet until that point, chimed in. "I could never imagine letting something like that happen to me or to us," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "If someone tried to attack us, I'd fight back. I'd make sure I protected you." I glanced at him, a little surprised by his sudden outburst. Daniel was never the type to talk about violence, and I found it strange that he was so passionate about something like this. But I also knew he was trying to be reassuring, trying to show his strength. We had been through a rough patch, and I guess he was trying to assert some control in our increasingly unstable relationship. I smiled, but there was a sharpness to my tone that I didn't anticipate. "Oh please, you're too weak to protect me," I said with a laugh. The words came out quickly without thinking, but once I said them I realized how cruel they sounded. I had meant it as a joke, a harmless jab to make light of the situation. But I could see from Daniel's face that it didn't land that way. The room fell silent. The laughter stopped, and everyone shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My mom's eyes widened in disbelief, and my dad cleared his throat, trying to break the awkwardness. But Daniel didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just sat there staring at me, his expression frozen. I instantly regretted what I had said. It wasn't meant to hurt him, but in that moment, I realized just how much damage a careless remark could cause. I opened my mouth to apologize, to explain that it was just a joke, but before I could speak, Daniel stood up. His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back roughly, the sound louder than I expected. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me in a stunned silence. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a mix of guilt and confusion. What had I done? How had a joke, a small, thoughtless comment, turned into something that had shattered the fragile peace we had been trying to rebuild? I watched him walk away, but I didn't know how to fix it. The moment Daniel stood up and left the table, a wave of disbelief washed over me. I sat there, still holding my fork in my hand, my mouth half open as I stared at the empty space where he had been. The noise of the dinner, the clattering of plates and utensils, seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a deafening silence that filled the room. It wasn't just the abruptness of his departure that shocked me. It was the look on his face, the expression of hurt and resignation. I had seen Daniel upset before, but this was different. There was a quiet anguish in his eyes, as if my words had cut deeper than I could have ever imagined. He didn't yell, he didn't throw a tantrum. He simply stood up and walked away. But in that simple action, I felt a sense of finality, as if he had reached a point where he could no longer tolerate the underlying tension between us. My family, who had been engaged in their own conversations moments before, suddenly became hyper-aware of the shift in the room. My mom looked at my dad, as if silently asking what to do next, while my brother and sister exchanged uncertain glances. No one knew how to react. They knew Daniel and I had been going through something, but no one knew the depth of it, not like I did. It wasn't just a disagreement. It wasn't just a few words exchanged in frustration. It was a reflection of a much bigger issue. The growing distance between us, the way we had both retreated into our own corners, unwilling to truly face the cracks in our marriage. For a few moments no one said anything. The sound of my heart pounding in my chest was louder than any conversation around the table. I wanted to apologize, to explain that I hadn't meant to hurt him, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I take back what I had said? How could I undo the damage of a single remark? I knew that in that instant it wasn't about the words themselves. It was about how they had exposed a deeper truth that neither of us had been ready to confront. I could feel my mom's eyes on me, but I couldn't meet her gaze. I had never wanted to disappoint her, but I knew she could see the regret in my eyes. She had always believed in the love Daniel and I shared, and now I felt like I was shattering that belief right in front of her. "Emma, go talk to him," my mom finally said, her voice soft but insistent. "This isn't you. You need to fix this." But the truth was, I didn't know how to fix it. How do you repair something that's been slowly breaking for months? How do you undo the accumulation of hurt, misunderstandings, and unsaid words? I was stuck in that moment of uncertainty, trapped between guilt and confusion. The realization that my thoughtless joke had pushed Daniel to this point, the point of walking away, was a hard pill to swallow. I excused myself from the table, my legs feeling heavy as I walked toward the door. But before I could leave the room, my dad spoke up, his voice unusually stern. "Emma," he said, "sometimes the silence speaks louder than any argument. Don't let this go on too long." I nodded, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a cloud of unspoken truth. I had never realized how much damage could be done in a moment of careless humor. It wasn't just about the joke, it was about everything beneath it. The frustration, the unresolved tension, the lack of communication. And as I stepped outside into the night air, I realized that the silence between Daniel and me was louder than any confrontation. It was a silence that spoke volumes. The days that followed Daniel's sudden departure from the dinner table were the longest of my life. Each day felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the regret gnawed at me. I could hear his footsteps, the sound of his absence, echoing through our house. The silence between us was suffocating. He hadn't called me, hadn't responded to my messages. I'd attempted to reach out several times, but each time the silence remained. I spent hours pacing around the house, replaying that moment over and over in my mind. What had I done? How could a simple, thoughtless remark have driven him to leave without a word? I had always known that Daniel wasn't the type to pick fights or make a scene, but I had never imagined he would shut me out entirely. I kept telling myself it was just a joke, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down I knew that wasn't the truth. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't just the words I'd said. It was the underlying message behind them. It wasn't about calling him weak. It was about my lack of faith in him, my inability to see him as strong in the ways that mattered. I had underestimated him, and now I was paying the price. The hardest part wasn't the silence between us. It was the growing realization that I had been blind to the cracks in our relationship for months. Daniel had always been patient, always willing to listen, to support me. But over time I had taken him for granted. I had stopped appreciating the quiet strength he brought to our marriage, and I had focused too much on what he wasn't, rather than acknowledging all that he was. I had always thought I could get away with making these small jokes, these little digs. After all, it was all in good fun, wasn't it? But now I could see that these jokes had built up over time, each one slowly eroding the foundation of trust and respect that we had once shared. I tried to busy myself with work, with distractions, but the emptiness in our home was overwhelming. The quiet space where we used to laugh, where we used to talk about everything and nothing, now felt like a void. Every room seemed to remind me of the distance between us, and every time I passed the places we used to share moments of closeness, I felt the weight of my mistake. I couldn't help but think back to the last few months, the distance, the tension, the quiet frustration that had simmered beneath the surface. We hadn't been communicating properly for a while now, both of us retreating into our own worlds, not addressing the issues that had been growing in the background. I had been too focused on my own stress, my own unhappiness, to notice that Daniel was silently suffering too. But the silence between us now wasn't just a result of my words. It was a reflection of everything we hadn't said, everything we hadn't dealt with. I could see now how my inability to communicate, to truly listen, had put us in this place. I felt like I was drowning in the weight of the unspoken things between us, and the more I tried to reach out, the more distant he seemed. Days turned into a week and still there was no sign of him. I couldn't keep waiting forever. I had to do something, anything, to try and fix this, to repair what I had broken. But how do you fix something that feels irreparably damaged? How do you bridge a gap that's been widening for so long? And most of all, how do I make up for a mistake that seemed too big to undo? A week had passed since Daniel left, and I had reached my breaking point. The silence was unbearable. The constant weight of regret and frustration weighed heavily on my chest. I had tried everything. Sending messages, leaving voicemails, even calling his best friend in an attempt to get through to him. But nothing had worked. Daniel wasn't responding. He wasn't even acknowledging my attempts to fix things. I didn't know how much longer I could bear it. It was late one evening when I decided that enough was enough. I couldn't sit around waiting any longer, torturing myself with what-ifs. I needed to see him, to talk to him face to face. I couldn't fix what had happened over text or with a simple phone call. This needed to be addressed in person. And if Daniel wasn't going to come to me, then I was going to go to him. I gathered my courage and drove to his apartment. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I navigated the familiar roads, each one feeling like an eternity as I approached the place that used to feel like home. When I pulled into the parking lot, my heart was racing and my palms were sweating. I was scared. Scared of how he would react. Scared of what he would say. Scared of the possibility that he might turn me away completely. I took a deep breath before stepping out of the car, trying to steady my nerves. I was determined. I had to face whatever was coming, no matter how difficult it would be. As I approached his door, I hesitated for a moment. I thought back to the last time I had been here, how everything had felt so easy and right between us. But that was before my careless words shattered everything. I knocked gently, waiting for what felt like an eternity. When there was no answer, I knocked again, louder this time, and then again. Finally, I heard footsteps from the other side of the door. My heart skipped a beat. The door creaked open slowly, and there he stood, looking as if he hadn't slept in days. His face was tense, his expression unreadable. The moment I saw him, all the words I had rehearsed in my mind flew out of my head. I didn't know where to begin. "What do you want, Emma?" His voice was low and guarded, almost cold. There was no warmth, no hint of the man I once knew. I felt a pang of sadness in my chest, but I couldn't back down now. This had to be said. "I'm sorry," I blurted out, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I didn't mean what I said. It was a stupid, careless joke and I should have never made it. I hurt you and I can see that now. I didn't realize how much it would affect you. But Daniel, I need you to understand that I never thought you were weak. I never meant to make you feel like I didn't believe in you. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine as if he were trying to determine whether I was being sincere. I could see the conflict in his gaze. He was torn. But then, something in his expression softened. He stepped back, opening the door wider, inviting me in. "Come inside," he said quietly. I hesitated for just a second before walking in, my heart pounding in my chest. We sat on the couch, the silence hanging between us as I struggled to find the right words. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel spoke. "I don't know what to say, Emma. You hurt me more than I ever thought possible. But what's worse is that you didn't even realize it. You made a joke about me being weak, about not being able to protect you. I've always tried to be your protector. I've always tried to make you feel safe. And for you to just dismiss me like that, it felt like a betrayal." His voice cracked slightly, and I could hear the pain behind his words. It was in that moment that I truly understood how deeply I had wounded him. I wasn't just apologizing for a joke, I was apologizing for undermining him in a way that had hurt his sense of self, his sense of who he was in our relationship. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I was wrong, and I didn't realize what I was doing. I never wanted to make you feel like that." Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze drifting away as he took a deep breath. "I need time to process all of this, Emma. But right now, I'm not sure where we go from here." The air between us was thick with uncertainty, but for the first time in over a week, I felt a flicker of hope. At least we were talking. At least we were beginning to break through the silence, starting the difficult journey of understanding each other again. A few days passed after our confrontation, and in those days something shifted. It wasn't an immediate fix, nothing that could instantly erase the damage I had caused, but the small, quiet moments of understanding between Daniel and me started to add up. We talked more. Not just about the joke, but about everything that had been building up over time. The misunderstandings, the small resentments, the things we had avoided talking about. There was no dramatic declaration of love, no instant forgiveness. Instead, it was the slow, steady rebuilding of something that had once felt unshakable. I found myself waking up each morning with a little more hope, a little more optimism. The house didn't feel as cold anymore. Daniel and I didn't have to be perfect, but we were really trying to understand one another again. One evening, I came home from work to find Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, his eyes tired but calm. He didn't say anything at first, but when he looked up, there was a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there just a few days ago. "Emma," he said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and about everything else." I took a deep breath, my heart racing. I wasn't sure what he was going to say, but I braced myself. "I realized," he continued, "that it wasn't just your joke that hurt me. It was everything that led up to it. I felt invisible for a while. Like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. And I think I let that fester. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to burden you with my problems. But the truth is, I've been struggling too." His words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time, I truly saw the weight he had been carrying, the burden he had kept hidden, believing he needed to protect me from it. I realized then that we had both been living in our own bubbles of hurt and misunderstanding. We hadn't communicated, not really. Not in the way we needed to. I sat down across from him, my hands trembling slightly. "I didn't know you felt that way," I said softly. "I didn't realize I was making things harder for you. I've been so focused on my own feelings, on my own mistakes, that I failed to see what you were going through. I'm so sorry." Daniel reached across the table and took my hand, his grip warm but tentative, as though he was still unsure. "I don't want you to be sorry," he said. "I want us to be better. I want us to be stronger together." I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like we were on opposite sides. We were facing each other, both vulnerable, both willing to admit our flaws. And for the first time, it felt like we could move forward. Slowly, carefully, but together. "We have a lot of work to do," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try. I don't want to lose you." He squeezed my hand, his eyes searching mine. "I don't want to lose you either. We just need to keep talking, Emma. Keep being honest with each other." In that moment, I realized that the joke, the hurt, the silence, it had all been a wake-up call. It had forced us to confront what we had been avoiding for far too long. And though it had been painful, it was also necessary. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where we could face our issues head-on together. That night, as we sat together, talking for hours about our hopes and fears, I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long while, I believed in us again. We were rebuilding one conversation at a time, and no matter how long it took, we would face it together. We had survived the storm, and though it had shaken us, we had emerged stronger, more aware of each other's needs, and more determined than ever to make it work. And that was enough.